Today we are talking about the Glore Psychiatric Museum. I recently went there with my husband and it was so cool and I learned a lot. So I want to share with you guys what I saw and the history of psychiatric treatment, and buckle up because it's sad and it's scary and it's crazy. We get to see where the psychiatric facility was. We also get to learn about the patients and some of the treatments they used and the history of this psychiatric hospital in Missouri. So it's a really cool subject to talk about. I deep dove into a lot of psychology. Guys, all the pictures and the videos of the museum and what we saw when we went there, and then talk about some of the history behind these different items and these different techniques. So I am so excited to share this with you, and let's get started. Some of the subjects that I talk about in this video are very disturbing and can very much trigger someone. I also want to make sure that I point out that some of the words used to talk about the hospital and the patients are outdated, are offensive, and we don't use them anymore. So I'm going to try my best to say patient and hospital when I'm talking about the facility and the people there, but there was some very offensive words that they used back in the day for someone who is experiencing mental illness. So I just want to point out that this video can be triggering to some folks, so if you don't want to see that, that's completely fine. All right, so first I want to talk about the history of the museum there in St. Joe, Missouri. On November 9th, 1874, the State Hospital for the Insane No. 2 opened up right outside of St. Joe, Missouri. I was wondering why they called it No. 2, so I did some research behind that, and it was because there's already a hospital in Missouri at the time. The first hospital was located in Fulton, Missouri, so that's why they called this one in St. Joe No. 2. Has gone through many name changes. It has gone from the State Hospital for the Insane, the Lunatic Asylum, and also just the State Hospital. So it's had some name changes, and it's kind of progressively gotten better as time has went on, as we kind of learned more about mental illness. They began with just 25 patients. The superintendent is quoted as saying, "The noble work of reviving the human heart and dispelling the pretentious clouds that penetrate the intellects of the mind diseased." And that went on for another 127 years. It soon filled with more and more beds, first 225, then 275, then 250 beds were added. The peak population was 3,000 in the 1950s. In the beginning years of the hospital, it pretty much ran itself with the patients and the staff. They had cattle, they had crops, they made their own clothing, they did all their own work and cooked their own food. There was a rumor that supposedly all they had to buy was sugar and salt. So it pretty much ran itself, and the patients did a big job in that. In 1899, there was a name change to the St. Joe State Hospital, which is better. Throughout history, St. Joe State Hospital used kind of the latest and greatest techniques on their patients. Now, I say latest and greatest because it was not. It was basically torture. And you'll see as we go on how incredibly horrible these treatments were. The staff and the doctors really believed that they were helping people. They thought that these techniques were making people better. They also had the belief that once someone enters the state hospital that they weren't leaving, that they were basically going to die there. And so to do these techniques on people were the only way to really help people get through their mental illness. So the doctors and the staff believed that they were doing the right thing. And you can see through history that people believed that they were doing the right thing in psychiatric history, but they really weren't. We as a people just weren't knowledgeable about the health of the human body, let alone the mental health. We just didn't know what was going on. We didn't know what was going to help. We didn't have the medication that we have today. And so you'll see these people were desperate to try to help or cure or something with the people that were suffering with mental illness. By the early 1990s, pretty much everybody, except for a few, were released back into society. The hospital was transformed into a prison where it now holds over 18,000 inmates. It's interesting in this country how we lock up people that we don't know how to deal with, whether it be in prisons or institutions like this. In 1967, the Glore Psychiatric Museum was opened. It was started by a man named George Glore, who was a staff there at the St. Joe State Hospital. He was very interested in a lot of the timeline of the Psychiatric Museum, so he started kind of collecting, as you will see, a lot of these older techniques and a lot of the things that they used. And his collection just grew and grew into the Glore Psychiatric Museum. It is now one of the most unique attractions in the country. The museum is now located where the medical and the admin building used to be on the state hospital grounds. So you're standing where they used to do a lot of the medical treatments. So we have gone on a pretty big journey as this country into some different things that people used to use. Of course, in the beginning, people thought that demons were inhabiting the body. So they would try to do everything they could to get the demons out, which included bloodletting, beating, stomping, exorcisms, and even death. So now we're going to talk about the things that I saw in the museum and some of the stories behind these things, which is super, super interesting. This first picture is a Fulton restraint box. So this was in the Fulton Center instead of the St. Joe Center, but they used to put people in these restraint boxes who were incompliant. So whether they told the staff no or they were a harm to themselves or others, they would be locked in these boxes. This first one that you see is a metal one, and it dates back 300 years. Then you'll see more of a wooden box and some ones that have the head hole so you can see the patient in there, but if you got tired of seeing them or they were acting up, there would be a piece of wood that just came down and covered their face. These boxes, of course, became a big violation of human rights, and so people stopped using them. They still use straitjackets and forms of restraint today, but a lot of the boxes that were built are outdated and not used anymore. One thing that was really interesting in the museum was there was a lot of rocking chairs. There was wooden rocking chairs, just different kinds, and these patients would rock, and that would be very soothing to them. And it has been proven in a lot of studies that it reduces depression and anxiety to rock back and forth. This is what was said about the Nevada rocking chairs. Patients at the state hospitals benefited from therapeutic use of rocking chairs. The chairs were made at the hospitals, often by patients who worked in a carpentry shop. Each chair had a distinctive creak, and each patient had their favorites. In the 1950s, state officials decided to get rid of the old rocking chairs at the state hospital number 3 in Nevada. When they switched to newer, non-moving, padded metal chairs, the patients became agitated, and medication had to be increased. A few of the old rockers were saved from the trash and returned to the wards where they were fought over by the patients. So this was a really soothing technique for them, and when they tried to get rid of them, the patients became very agitated because, first of all, this was one of the things that they did to relax, but second of all, it's a huge change in their routine, which would cause a lot of distress. The children's program started in 1962, trouble fitting into their homes and schools. They were given many different labels: emotionally disturbed, special education, and mental ill. Some came from abusive or neglective homes. Others had learning disabilities. Some students had lower IQs, but others were exceptionally high. The children in the Woodson Center helped make and clean up these really, really cool cars that you see here. That's what they spent their time on. They would do little projects together, and I think that's really cool to kind of let out some of their creativity. So we went on to the morgue. The morgue and autopsy room were located originally in this building when it was constructed in 1969. Prior to that time, there was a morgue in the Park building where bodies were held and autopsies were completed when requested. The morgue was used to hold bodies of patients until family members made funeral home arrangements and had bodies transported. The morgue and the autopsy room were also put into use by the state of Missouri anytime there was a suspicious death or a death that might involve foul play. At one point in the hospital's history, a family of 4 that were murdered in northwest Missouri were brought to this morgue and autopsies were performed. On occasion, bodies were pulled from the river, brought to this morgue for identification, autopsies, and holding. There was intentional death and also accidental death that had happened at the hospital. Intentional death at the state hospital included suicides and murders. Patients killed themselves by hanging, setting themselves on fire, shooting themselves with guns, or jumping off of buildings into wells. One patient poisoned himself with arsenic in 1934. The same year, a patient was murdered by another patient who used a spade handle to fracture the skull. The state hospital witnessed many accidental deaths. In 1938, a patient strangled in her restraints when she fell out of bed. In 1959, there were 13 deaths recorded as accidents. Strangely enough, that year there were 2 deaths from choking on peach seeds. Other patients died from head injuries after slipping on ice or falling out of bed. So as you can see, there was many deaths in the hospital, whether intentional or not intentional. The hospital, of course, also in history found themselves with a lot of sickness. So I think this place is haunted. There is a lot of death. I'm sure there's a lot of spirits. So that's very, very interesting to me. This story is one of the most talked about from the Psychiatric Museum and also one of the most interesting. This is the stomach contents of a woman who had pica, eating things that are not food. It's a disorder. All of this stuff was removed from the female patient in 1927. She became ill, and when they removed the objects, she died during the procedure. 1,446 objects were removed. Items included nuts, bolts, earrings, thimbles, and many other things. Now, pica has been related to OCD. So as you can see, these are all the things that removed from her body. And you can see kind of towards the bottom where there was stomach bile. So they just took everything out and just laid it out on this place right here. And then now it's in the Glore Psychiatric Museum, which is really, really cool. So this was an interesting exhibit as well. In 1971, a man patient was caught putting letters into the back of a TV. And one of the staff members caught him, and when the electrician came, they found 525 papers and letters in the back of his TV, all stating that the hospital was stealing his money. He also stated that they kept his thoughts in boxcars behind the building. There were a lot of exhibits there in the hospital about solitary confinement or just confinement in general. These were interesting to actually see in real life how these people were locked up. There was an interesting exhibit called Phrenology, which is the thought of the shape of your head determines your psychological attributes. There was interesting dolls made that showed the different ancient time techniques that people used, such as stomping on the patient, a form of casting out demons. Straitjackets, of course, which would become very hazardous because you could suffocate, and like I said in the morgue part, that some people would get hung on their straps. Bloodletting, which is where they would cut an incision, usually in the back of your foot, and just drain your blood as much as they could. And of course, these patients went in fighting, and when they had so much blood loss, they would become a little bit more less combative. And so they thought that they were doing the right thing, and they thought that they were casting out these demons, but really these people were losing so much blood that they had no other choice. There was a lot of exhibits on water dousing or water treatments where they would spray hoses on the patients, drop the patient into water, or just spray the patient in the face with cold water. Also having them take excessively long cold or hot showers as a form of either punishment or treatment. So this is the tranquilizer chair. The tranquilizer chair was developed by Benjamin Rush, the father of psychiatry in the United States. Near the end of the 18th century, a disturbed patient could be strapped into the chair until they became calm. The chair, which held arms, legs, body, and head in a state of total immobility, was intended to heal through lowering pulse and relaxing the muscles. While the patient was confined in the device, Dr. Rush would perform various treatments, such as bloodletting by knife or with leeches. The patient's feet might be placed into a tub of scalding hot water, while ice packs were applied to the head. The patient's arms might be lifted so that the ice water could be poured down his sleeves. So as you can see, these treatments were just getting more and more and more into torture. They were just really trying to do the most that they could to these people. And like I said, some of these doctors probably thought that what they were doing was right, but as you look back on it today, it is a lot of torture and horrible things that they were doing. They also were causing more harm than good, because I'm sure that being poured water on or being locked up would cause more mental distress than it would healing. This was an interesting device. This is called the swinging chair. Patients would be strapped into the box, and the doctor or staff would basically spin them as a treatment. This is another large spinning device. They had the belief that spinning would either cast out demons or heal the patient. This was an interesting piece of information on trepidation, which is the removal of a piece of skull. And this has been done for many, many, many years, even ancient times. Even back to cavemen, they had saw knives and pieces of skull where they had tried to take apart someone's skull. Trepidation is the removal of the piece of skull from a living patient to expose the dura mater, or tough fibrous membrane forming the outer envelope of the brain. Trepidation of human skulls is found in archaeology recorded as early as 7,000 years ago. It was independently practiced in many areas and cultures throughout the world. The operation may have been performed for spiritual or therapeutic reasons, such as relieving insanity, headaches, or intracranial pressure. Some skulls evidence healing around the opening indication of the patient survived the operation and lived for some years afterward. So I do think that one of the most interesting parts of this museum talked about lobotomies. There's a fascination in this country of lobotomies, and it's because this was such an interesting and horrible idea. These operations were done on people while they were awake, usually no medication, and they would put a slit in the front of the brain thinking that it would heal. So what's interesting to me is this was Howard Dudley. As request of his stepmother, Howard Dudley was lobotomized by Dr. Freeman in 1960. Dudley was 12 years old. Dr. Freeman lobotomized 19 children under the age of 18. The youngest was 4 years old. Today, Dudley is a successful husband, father, and author. In 2007, he wrote about his life before and after the lobotomy in his memoir, My Lobotomy. An MRI performed in 2009 showed much damage to his frontal lobes from the lobotomy. However, due to his young age at the time, his brain adapted to the injury as he matured. It was case number 1211942. Before the operation, forever fighting. She was the meanest woman. 11 days after the lobotomy, she giggles a lot. These lobotomies, sometimes they would just cut until there was no more reaction, and this would cause a lot of damage to the person. And of course, the most famous and one of the most interesting was Rosemary Kennedy. She is the sister of John F. Kennedy. Her father arranged for her lobotomy in 1941 when she was 23 years old. The doctor was quoted as saying, "We went through the top of the head. I think she was awake. She had a mild tranquilizer. I made a surgical incision in the brain through the skull. It was near the front. It was on both sides. We just made a small incision, no more than an inch. The instrument Dr. Watts used looked like a butter knife. He swung it up and down to cut brain tissue. We put the instrument inside," he said. As Dr. Watts cut, Dr. Freeman put questions to Rosemary. For example, he asked her to recite the Lord's Prayer, or sing God Bless America, or count backwards. We made an estimate on how far to cut based on how she responded. When she became incoherent, they stopped. The results were tragic. The once very social Rosemary lived out the remainder of her life in institutions. This is super sad. The case of Rosemary Kennedy is very interesting because one of the reasons that they did this was because she was just different than her family. The Kennedys were a very proper and prim and rich family, and she liked to party and was kind of rebellious. And so that's one of the reasons they led her to be lobotomized, and it completely changed her life. On July 8th, 1949, Walter Freeman did 10 lobotomies in 3 hours at the Missouri State Hospital No. 2. This is a picture of their living space. As you can see, it was just a bed and sometimes a nightstand, sometimes a rocking chair. There are many examples of artwork and ways that these patients express themselves. Some would knit, some would do paintings, they would do sculptures. There was a big outlet for art, and some people who couldn't communicate at all used art to express their feelings, and these were some of the exhibits that they did. One of the biggest things and the reasons that I wanted to do this video was the stigma around mental health. And so I just wanted to point out some of the things about mental health in this country. 1 in 5 Americans are affected by mental health conditions. A stigma is a set of negative and often unfair beliefs that a society has about something. The ways you can break the stigma around mental health is to educate yourself and others, encourage others to help break the stigma, see the person, not only the condition, telling others how common mental illness is, and talking openly about mental illness. So I wanted to share some of my thoughts on the museum as well as the mental health stigmas. I think we've come a long way. I think that we've learned a lot more about mental illness. It's not so much of a stigma as it used to be, but I still think that there's a lot of people who judge people based on mental illnesses. And 1 out of 5 people, that's your neighbor, that's your mom, that's your friend who has a mental illness. And so we really need to be more open and talk about these things so that people can get help. I definitely think the treatments are better today than they used to be. There was a lot of very inhumane treatments that happened, and I'm so glad that now talk therapy and medication is more of a prevalent thing. It was definitely the most interesting museum I've ever been to. This place, I'm sure, is like 100% haunted. I'm sure it's very creepy. I'm sure it's super creepy at night. And they do night-ins where you can sleep at the museum, or there's ghost hunters that come. So please, please, please look into the St. Joe Psychiatric Museum. They have other museums as well if you want to check those out. But look into their events. Please go. Please tell me your reactions to the museum and let me know what you think about it, because it was so interesting and I'm so glad that we got to go. That's it, guys. I'm gonna put a little bit of a slideshow here at the end where I also drop in some pictures that just didn't fit anywhere but are very, very cool. So I hope you guys enjoy those. If you like this video, please give it a big thumbs up and a subscribe. I'm growing my channel and I would love to hear from you guys, so comment below, tell me what you think, because I'm very excited to share with you all of my information, and also want to know what you guys think. If you've been to this museum, please comment below your experiences. And tell me also what other things that you want to see. True crime cases, more history, and just drop me a comment. Let me know you're here. All right, guys, that's it for me today, and I will see you guys next time. Bye. If you or someone you know is struggling, please head over to mentalhealthishealth.us. This is also the National Suicide Prevention Hotline.